Hello, I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, Ramparts of a Strong Pet Food Safety System. Ask the Pet Food Pro connects experts with industry professionals and offers the opportunity to pose questions directly. Ask the Pet Food Pro is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and Pet Food Industry's journalists and editors. Drawing our combined decades of experience covering the dog, cat, and other pet food markets, you can find our reporting and analysis at petfoodindustry.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter and monthly magazine. Today's discussion focuses on building the ramparts of a strong food safety system. Neogen and Pet Food Compliance sponsor this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, and welcome to our expert guest, Will Henry, owner of Turkey Creek Holdings. Welcome, Will, and thank you for joining us today.
You bet. Thank you, Tim. Also want to thank the rest of your WAT team for inviting me on here. And again, my thanks to the sponsor as well. As most of you know, most of my tenure in the industry has been with One Solution Group. It was during that time that I led the charge to create the first industry equipment group to scientifically validate the pet food extrusion process with live pathogenic cultures on a commercial scale. Since leaving OneSG, I now operate my own consulting group, Turkey Creek Holdings, where I essentially do the same thing that I've been doing the last 30 years, project management and design, product development, and process improvement.
I'm sure a lot of folks out there have met you over the years, so I'm sure they're glad to see you on this show. Before we start our discussion about how to build that fortress of food safety, I do have a few little announcements for the audience. Audience members, you've all been muted to ensure that everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. I've included many of the questions that you all sent in beforehand into our script, but if you do have questions during the discussion, please submit those or any comments in the chat box. Please note that this chat is being recorded, so you can access the recording starting in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com. All right, so as we start building this fortress of food safety, let's really talk about some of your experience when you're building those core building blocks for those ramparts of that safety castle. What are the core building blocks of a pet food manufacturing safety environment?
Yeah, and I guess to preface that, Tim, you're right. This is all from my experience. This is not out of some textbook. It's not some program that you can sign up for. Just from what I've seen over the years, the performance of good food safety systems. It always starts in my mind with the technicians, the personnel. If you've got a group that care about what they do, they care about the quality of the work they provide, not the quality of the product per se, but their own persona of themselves, that's going to make or break any kind of good program. You could have the best SSOPs, the right research involved, but if you don't have the right technicians and team on staff to execute for you, that care about what they do, then it's not going to perform at the level that it should. So your technicians is first and foremost. I believe in strong prescriptive policies or SSOPs to the point where it's a step-by-step, like a recipe for baking a cake. Don't miss any single step out, no matter how small or minute it might be. Validated kill step is very critical. That's the foundation that you build your CCPs on and your control points. Without some sort of science to back up why you're doing what you do, then it's not truly valid. And it makes it much harder to protect as well. Continual research is a huge benefit, along with formulation and ingredient protection, which we'll cover some more of that later. I also like to see annual reviews and revised schedules for your food safety systems. And I say schedule, we'll cover some of that later, but it's not always a firm set frequency. Constant training, and then a good sampling program. Those, in my mind, all make up the core parts of what you need to do.
Gotcha. Yeah, we'll touch on all of those in turn as we go along. For right now, let's continue on with that kind of castle metaphor and consider how that siege on food safety could succeed. So where do you most often see food safety systems begin to break down on the plant floor, even when there are strong written programs that appear perfectly sound?
Even if all the key points are there, I would say some of the more common issues that I see, and not that, when I say issues, I'm not saying these guys are having hot spots and hits and this and that. It's just minimal breakdowns on how they fortify their positions. But I would say the two areas that I see the most is constant review and communications. We all need to realize that food safety systems, it's not a one and done execution. You don't review it once, you don't look at the science once. It's a constant effort to make sure you've got the right solution moving forward. I'm a firm believer in an annual review of the entire system, and that's typically considered a minimum requirement and acceptable, definitely annual. The caveat to that is if there are any changes made, changes in equipment model, in process flow, even as far as formulations, can have an impact on the efficacy of your food safety systems. So then those changes need to be vetted against your current system to determine if the efficacy is still there. The second part of that is let's communicate that back to the team, and not just the boots on the ground. Everyone from top to bottom needs to be made aware of here's the changes that were made in whatever aspect of the process. Here's what we've identified as a potential problem. Here's a corrective action, and here's how we prove this is the right way to go. And communicate that up the chain of command. The bigger part about that communications is it keeps everyone in the loop on the changes, so everybody knows what's going on. Everyone can talk somewhat intelligently. That becomes important during an audit or accreditation type of review. But it's especially true, the last half decade with the increased turnover rates that we see with plant staff.
Once again, it's coming back to what you mentioned before about staff really being key in this, and we'll definitely go into that in a little bit more in a second. So let's consider some of those safety plans. How can manufacturers ensure that their food safety plan is truly operational rather than simply a compliance document?
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in internal challenge studies, but then also annual verifications of the policies. So, for example, whatever validated study that you're using to support your CPs and CCPs, those studies or documentation must be correlated back to the equipment and the process profile that you're using in your facility. So let's take, for example, you look at an average production rate for pet food kibble dry expanded in the US. Average is going to be between, let's say it's 8.5, 9 tons an hour. That takes your mid-size, and it's on the low end of your larger machines. What you're trying to prove is that large machine at those higher rates is running in a safe and quality manner. But I have yet to be able to find, I hate to use absolutes, but I've yet to find a true validation study that utilizes that same equipment model to prove a kill step for salmonella. I'm not aware of any pilot plant or level 2 biosafety lab that could do that, much less do that at that high a scale. So what is done on a validation study is we scale it down a little bit. You can go as low as using small high pressure pumps to tabletop extruders with a 1-inch bore. We've seen them on a 3.25-inch bore machines. So the larger you can get, the better off you're going to be, but you're never going to get, and those machines run at the highest rate, maybe 0.5 ton an hour. So what you're doing is you're looking at a validation study that says, hey, we proved we can kill salmonella, but it was on this small machine. Your job as a manufacturer, once you decide to use that study, is you've got to draw the line that says, okay, what they did here in the lab per se, there's a direct linear correlation to what I'm doing with my large bore machine. And the only way that we can do that is with these internal challenge studies and a verification process that then we can document, and we end up with empirical data that proves whether we're looking at time, pressure, moisture, so forth, we're doing the same thing on the small machine as we're doing on the larger machine, just at a higher rate. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It actually touches on 2 questions that we've gotten from the audience before that I combined into one here. Some of our audience members have been wondering about how should a pet food maker design those internal inspections of risk assessment in order to keep an objective perspective on their own operations.
And I think staying more objective there is key. And I look at it from my standpoint. I walk around, my shop out, my farm shop here, and I designed it the way I want it. I like it. I'm happy with it. I see no faults. A buddy comes over and he goes, well, why'd you put that light switch over there? Wouldn't it make more sense over here? And that's the key point. People in-house, I believe, to get a truly objective perspective, you got to bring somebody in from the outside. So, because a lot of times, internal standpoint alone, you're not going to gain that objectivity. All right. You follow what I'm saying? Sometimes we get comfortable in our own homes, our own facilities. We don't see what's going on. And there's lots of groups out there. You look at, as far as external accreditations, SQF, AIB, BRC, ISO, and there's a multitude of private groups that can offer further insight as well. So, in my respect, I see the best performance when somebody says, we think we're doing a good job here. We think our house is clean, but once you come in here and take a look at it and see if we've got any gaps missing.
Gotcha. Yeah, getting that outside perspective is always important, just about anything.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
So when we're talking about some of the risks that they might be looking for, some of those, specific hazards, what are some of the most common hazards that you've seen in pet food production, and how have those evolved over the years?
So if I think back, and I might take a bit because I've been in here for a while, Tim. Sorry about that. I would say a majority of my call outs for food safety have been around usually one of two things. And it goes back up. This all ties together with communications from earlier, but it ties back to two major reasons to get called out to deal with a hazard or an issue. One is a structure modification in the facility, and the other one is equipment replacement. Structure modifications, and we've come across that numerous times over the years, both in regards to dealing with these hazards now that it's happened, but also in the process of helping a client modify their facility to improve, whether it's food safety, whether it's to improve efficiency, or just give it a facelift. But we're really cautious. I'm really cautious when I step into those situations because anytime you break into an existing structure, whether it's a support wall or breezeway, you always run the risk of coming across a previously hidden or, quote, secure harboring point for pathogens. And I say secure, meaning it's been kept away from the process to that point by whatever means. And then now it's exposed and allowed to migrate into the process area, whether it's under construction or after construction, and maybe proper sanitation wasn't taken care of. So when I'm involved in those type of projects, yeah, there's a lot of diligence involved with while assisting those projects to make sure that we're not doing that on purpose. So as far as if you need to take some paneling off, let's make sure we drape the area. Let's do pre-sanitization of everything. And then let's do post before we start carrying the stuff out. Everything gets foamed, wiped, sprayed, whatever your preferred method is. But even the stuff that we're demoing out before it leaves that area, it's being treated. Make sure it's nice and clean. So, and then same thing with equipment upgrades. Whether it's as simple as a motor upgrade on an extruder, you pop that shield off, you'd be changing the belts, changing the shivs. Maybe there was a harboring point in that old shield that you couldn't quite get to. And now that you've popped that off, it's now in the area. Now that is a pre-kill area, but still, if you're under construction, maintenance guys are walking in, they're not changing their boots, they're not putting smocks on. Maybe they don't have separate tool sets for the different pre-kill and post-kill zones. For the maintenance guys specifically, you see it a lot for maintenance. You see it a lot for the operators, but it's not as common with the maintenance crew to have separate set of tools for different zones in the plant. So that's why, and those are some of the biggest reasons. And to be honest, when we called in to do our starburst approach, that's one of the things that I always check is let's go check the toolbox of the maintenance crew. Let's swab some tools. Let's see where this is coming from. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer there, but
no, it makes a lot of sense that, any kind of change is going to introduce more risks. It almost reminds me of like some movie about like Ebola or something where they go into some untouched region of the jungle and next thing, some new virus is spreading.
Exactly. Yeah.
So kind of expanding on that a little bit, when plant managers and others are planning for this, what are some of the more frequent gaps you observe in the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive control for pet food facilities?
Yeah. Now you're going to get me in trouble here, making me badmouth it. And I'm not badmouthing any accreditation out there. They've all got pros, they've all got cons, but I think much of these subjective structures are not keeping up with the ever-changing landscape of the ingredient deck. All right, and not that they're supposed to. They're kind of like any other government regulation. You don't want government to come in too fast on something that's brand new on the market, whether it's an ingredient or it's how it's processed. you want them to take their time because you want them to get the answer correct when they get there. So I'm not saying this in a bad way, but there is a gap there. So as we come up and we find new ways to use novel ingredients or novel process flow, the risk assessment is decided in part, not just of the risk of the specific ingredient, but to the volume of what we're using that said ingredient. Okay. So again, it could be about the ingredient compositions, or it could just be how much we're using. When I do a risk table, that's what it's based on. I look at all the ingredients and I say, okay, this one's in general the most at risk, but I'm only using it 3% of the time, or it's only at 4% of the diet. So that's how I measure out how much risk I put to that one ingredient being used on this product. So take fresh meat products and even meat meals, for example. 20 years ago, you look at the ingredient decks, or 30 years ago, the average inclusion levels of those type of ingredients were much lower than they are today. You look at premium on the pet food aisles today, and it's a lot of it's about fresh meat, high meat, high protein, those kind of things. So when you consider that premium and top shelf, we're significantly higher on those ingredients than we ever have been. Have those products been through a challenge study to determine the efficacy of the current preventative controls? That's the question you need to ask yourself. So if your preventative controls, per se, on MDM chicken was performed 20 years ago and you're using it at 10% inclusion rate, but now you're including it at 70% inclusion rate, do you think we need to adjust our metrics on how we prevent a hazard from happening? So you got to look at it this way. The CFU load, or the colony forming units, that's how we measure the population of a pathogen within an ingredient, correlates. We can correlate that to moisture in the dryer on a typical extrusion process. When you set up an extrusion process or a recipe, I know my formulation is, I know my moisture coming out of the dryer is about 30% moisture content wet base. And we know that if we set the dryer at 275 Fahrenheit, our exit moisture is going to be 7%. So with those constraints in that formulation, we know exactly how much water we're going to be pulling out of that kibble. All right. However, if we take our moisture and go from 30% to 35%, but we don't adjust the dryer, then we can probably expect our moisture to climb by 5%, give or take. You understand what I'm saying there?
Right, right.
So more moisture in, we've got to adjust the dryer to get that moisture back down. It's the same thing when we look at risk assessment in terms of pathogens. It's not a linear correlation. I'm not saying you give me 2 extra log, we're going to have 2 left over. It's not quite that way. There's more dynamics involved, but it is very similar to that log reduction on those inclusion rates. Following HACCP, a CCP, or a critical control point, must be proven scientifically to affect a 5 log reduction of a pathogen. So 30 years ago, at 10% inclusion rate, we've got the perfect system. But now that I'm including more fresh meat, I might have run the risk of higher populations of salmonella. So if I only evaluate my process at 5 log, the bare minimum, but yet we have a 7 log inoculation for whatever reason, then you're going to end up with a measurable amount of pathogens that will survive. I'm not trying to scare anybody, but that's the reality.
Right. It's also kind of part of that common theme of change being one of the greatest threats, that things change, with the newest trends, more protein, high protein, and, it introduces a new challenge.
It does. You're absolutely right.
So I suppose the safest way would just not be to produce anything at all. But of course, facilities do have to. So
that's right.
So how should facilities balance preventive controls with the practical production realities, such as throughput demands and labor constraints?
Yeah, and throw in there also these new formulations that people are looking for, and not just the manufacturers. We've got great inventors out there, but the consumers also kind of drive some of that. So you got to throw all that together. And I say that throughput's not always the starting factor on that, Tim. Usually it's something that's changed in something a little different on the end product, or maybe they want to use a different ingredient, whether because of sourcing or functionality for the animal. Usually it starts at that level on the ingredient deck or finished product specs, then that then affects throughputs and labor requirements and so forth. I'm going to start by saying your preventative controls should never be mitigated to support or enhance production and labor issues. Once you start mitigating your PCs, that's when you start seeing gaps in your food safety. Now, there are some short-term things you can do. For example, as you start some brand new diets, whether you're doing a low carb, high meat diet, and now you're at a 25% rate reduction to even make the product. Well, that's fine. Let's maintain that and make good quality product and maintain our PCs. But then let's go back to the core part and let's do some research. How can we make some modifications, not during production, to increase those rates? So for that, let's talk about throughput. That's always at the foremost. When I talk to VP of manufacturing, that's what they need. That's what their OEOs or the OEOs are built on, is how much can we make? What makes us the most efficient? Not just because we all want to make money, but because we want to be more efficient in how we do our process. So we get a nice, reasonable, economical product on the shelf. And we're going to assume for this discussion that we're not changing anything else. We're just dealing with throughput. But typically when you try to increase the rates beyond what the process is really designed for in terms of the product, you'll typically see a reduction in retention times. As you recall, Tim, earlier we talked about the constraints for CCPs. One of those on a validation study could be retention time. You look at your D and Z values and what it takes to destroy salmonella. It's all about time. So they're an important part of that pathogenic death. And if we could, let's focus on the preconditioner. That's an easy model to look at in terms of retention time. So if the preconditioner is our bottleneck, we've got numerous levers that we can pull to increase that or improve that, especially as we look at changing it to different type of diets. So you've got paddle configurations, an easy one, and shaft speed. And I've been coming across this even in the last 3 months with our equipment is 20 years old. It's still a viable equipment model. We've been doing rebuilds every 6 months on it. It's staying in good shape. We're cleaning it, we're polishing it, but we haven't looked at the paddle configuration in I don't know how long. So, but there's been so many advancements on paddle configurations, how we operate the preconditioners, that maybe they just weren't aware of. So you've got that lever, you've got shaft speed. For some diets, increased moisture to help on throughput. And that may cost you a little bit on the dryer in terms of drying efficiencies, but a little bit extra moisture in the preconditioner helps to expedite thermal energy transfer, which is what we're using to help destroy our pathogens. So we should also not negate potential ingredient deck changes. As we're pulling in new ingredients that we're trying to use for functional reasons, we've got other ingredients that are also there for functional, but they fill out the ingredient deck. It's also good that let's look at a few of those that are not part of our marketing signature, that's not part of the brand, and maybe choose some ingredients that cook with less energy, that maybe are not hygroscopic, that want to soak up moistures and pull that away from the starches and the proteins that we're trying to cook. So the concept is let's look at multiple areas to get those up there. But like I said before, let's not first go to the PCs and see what we can do there. Because yeah, you can play with temperatures and take those down or take them up. And that might be inside or outside your PC range. So that's not where I would go first. Take that research offline, figure it out there. Yes, deal with momentary lapse in throughput, but this will be a much better way to move forward and a safer way to maintain your business.
Gotcha.
Make sense?
It does. And so when we're considering like in between batches or killing off pathogens overall, let's consider sanitation programs briefly. Just how can a sanitation program be strengthened to better prevent that cross-contamination, particularly in a dry pet food operation?
Again, I think it comes back to education, having the good technicians that say, is there something better that we can do? Is there a better chemical? Is there a better sponge, a better swab? And I think ongoing education is the best way to boost those sanitation programs. And in my mind, a dedicated sanitation team is always the best way to do that. I know that some companies are structured where you've got operators that they stay in the extruder room, they do all the maintenance, they do all the sanitation, and they do all the changeovers and the operations. And that's fine that you've got a core group that can do all that. But from my standpoint, especially when you're cleaning out of place, CIP is pretty easy to design and build the controls in to mitigate 95% of those risks. So when you're doing clean out of place, that's when it's nice to have a dedicated crew that knows what they're doing. And again, they care about what they're doing. They're getting continual education on what's available in the marketplace for what's new and some of these tools that we can use or chemicals that we can use. And anybody can also get direct links to the equipment providers to say, hey, here's what we're doing. Is there a better way to do this? And everything, again, it's got to go back to being science-based, Tim. But you can't just pull something off the internet and say, yeah, this is what this document says. No, the FDA says it's got to be science-based procedures that we're doing.
So once again, one thing you had mentioned there was the importance of that dedicated team and the importance of the employees. That's been a theme that you brought up multiple times. So let's kind of go into that a little bit more, looking at the importance of the employees in these systems and their education and their management. So what role can management play and management's commitment to this in sustaining an effective food safety culture across departments, whether it's a dedicated sanitation team or one that kind of does it all?
Yeah, and you use the right term there, Tim. I mean, culture is, there's no other way to explain it. And it's true. It's true not just for food safety. It's true for every segment. I was recently at a job site and the extrusion operators, they had a culture within their group. They were constantly vigilant on checking the product every 10 minutes, doing size, shape, cuts, doing densities. That's because they care about what they did. That's also true with the sanitation group. That's true with the guys running the coating and packaging. So we're not just talking about culture of just the food safety systems in that segment. And with management, you've got to lead by example. If I go into a plant and I see the QA technicians they're wearing their gloves, they got all their PPE on, and then I see a manager walk in, he doesn't have his beard net on. That tells me there's a breakdown between the culture of who's on the plant floor and who's managing. But when you're taken into a plant, you're led in there by the manager and by the QA tech, and they're giving you a 15-minute rundown on here's all your PPE in here, here's what you can do, here's what you can touch. If you need something touched, you talk to me first. When I get that kind of welcoming, I feel so much better about what I'm going to walk into.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Or if I'm just say, here's a key card, extruder's out there, I'm like, wait a minute. That doesn't give me much confidence in the jobs ahead.
Gotcha.
So
yeah,
they've got to lead by example.
Leading by example, indeed. And it can be kind of difficult to perhaps transmit that culture into especially if there's a turnover or even if things change with new configurations like you were mentioning. Mm-hmm. But there's also a balance there. So if a company's trying to simplify their food safety program, how can they then avoid weakening some of those critical preventive controls?
That's a very good point, because we all know simpler is better. If it's the simpler it is to do, the more likely it's going to get done. But you can look at it a few different ways. Some companies or some facilities may not be able to simplify simply due to the initial design of these legacy facilities. And what I mean by that, Tim, is there are some brand new facilities out there that have been built in the last 3 to 5 years. Very nice facilities. And even with a brand new facility, there's no guarantee that you've designed it in a way that best simplifies your food safety system. Because you're not just trying to attack that one module, you're trying to simplify it for numerous aspects: lean manufacturing, personnel, quality of life, et cetera. So that's not really a fair statement to say, but in terms of food safety discussion, whether you have a pet food plant that started out 60 years ago as a corn mill, they have fewer levers they can pull to simplify their food safety systems than, say, a plant that was built 20 years ago to make pet food. And I'm not saying that to denigrate anybody in the market by any means. I'm just saying that's the reality of it. That's how a lot of these large companies got started. Is, hey, we're doing this over here, but we can add on and do this here, and they're doing it consciously, and they're doing a very good job of it. They just may be limited to how they can modify their structures and pathways to simplify their food safety system simply because of how they're captured into that legacy facility. Now, again, I want to go back and say, my earlier statement, modifications to current structures and architectures has shown to drastically simplify food safety systems, but we've got to mitigate those risks of construction of potentially finding those harbor points and be conscious when we do that. So yes, I do recommend making those changes. That's my final answer on that. But let's be methodical and let's be prescriptive about how we demo certain areas and we rebuild them back up. Let's be careful when we do it. Because you're right, a simple structure changing a wall or a breezeway to impact airflows or how long it takes for an operator to collect a sample and get back over to here, or even prohibit tracking of migrant particles from pre-kill to post-kill. Yeah, those are worth some changes. That's worth some of the risk of maybe finding some of those harboring points. So I agree. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. So when plant leaders are, maybe they've knocked out a wall or changed a system or something like that, what are some of the indicators or metrics that they should really be looking at to identify any early sign that their food safety system may be under stress?
Mold is always a good indicator. And if they're doing the representative sampling, they're not just looking for salmonella. They're going to get other counts like APCs, anaerobic plate counts. Those are always a good indicator. If those start to climb through my representative sampling, then I think I may have an issue somewhere. And that's when I start looking. It'll be more difficult to find the source point unless you get a true pathogenic hit like a salmonella hit. Once you find that, then it's easier to find that salmonella per se. If you're getting APC hits, I'd venture to guess there might be a few areas you're going to get APC hits, so it won't be as easy to find the true source. But that's somewhere to start. When you start seeing those climb up, and hopefully everyone on the call is I'm sure if they're doing these standard analysis tests that they're sending samples out for, they're getting that information back, whether it's APCs or total plate counts, et cetera. They're getting some of those details with that. They're not just getting hey, you're negative on salmonella. And if you are just doing that structure, I'd say that's one way to fortify your system is let's broaden your analysis, your testing of your products to include some of those other non-pathogenic organisms that can lead us to other problems.
Gotcha. And
Yeah.
to go back to something that you had mentioned before, while we're still talking about employees and plant management, you mentioned the importance of food safety going from the top to the bottom. And for that, you need a good training program. How can a training program be structured to ensure that employees at all levels understand their role in maintaining pet food safety?
Yeah. Well, again, let's go back to the simpler it is, the more likely it's going to happen. Otherwise, it won't get done. One of the better systems that I've seen for training is that when these groups put in dedicated media centers just for that purpose. And to the point where an operator, a technician, maintenance guy can walk in, swipe his card, and at any time of the day, if he's got a 15-minute break, he wants to go review something, or he comes in a half an hour early because he knows his training schedule is up. He can walk in, swipe his card to get in the door, sit down at a terminal, swipe his card, it logs him in, and he can pick off his list of what he's supposed to be training for, what's next on his list if he wants to train ahead. In my mind, that showed a level of investment and dedication from management, for one thing, to everybody else who within that culture wants to make sure they're still doing a good job. What I also liked about that system is that it alerted the operators that, hey, here's something that was just modified last week. You need to go review this. So they swipe the card to log in. It's automatic at that point. Anytime an SSOP is updated or a piece of equipment is modified by maintenance, they log it in there, and the appropriate people that are using that document, they're alerted right away. Okay, look at this. You need to retrain yourself because there's been a change. So I think that to me, that was top notch to see something like that invested to train their operators. But I think any good program, Tim, needs to have a good mix of classroom work, whether it's just on a computer, whether you invest on bringing in an outside speaker for a day or so to teach, or even for a couple hours to teach on certain subjects. But I think also that's got to be a good mix with hands-on training, for example, at a clean out of place bay. Okay, here's how we tear this pump apart. Here's how we sanitize it. Here's how we reassemble it. And doing some hands-on. You can get a lot from videos, and they've got those simple 2-minute cartoons now that the AI can generate for you and show how to do something. But you know as good as I do, getting out there and getting your hands dirty and just doing it yourself, that's where it really sinks into my mind.
Indeed. It's nothing like tactile learning. Learning by
Exactly.
The thing is, even if you've got the absolute best education system, you've got an excellent safety program, there's always still risks that can come in from outside. So in all your experience, how should pet food manufacturers approach verifying their suppliers to minimize and reduce upstream risks?
So not getting in trouble here, I'm going to say approach them carefully but firmly. And it really depends on what kind of ingredients you're using. If you're not using super exotic or novel ingredients, then you've got many options you can go to get those ingredients. However, there are some ingredients out there that are novel, are covered under patent or intellectual property, that if you approach that subject briskly, there may be some pushback. However, as a manufacturer, you cannot waver on the GAs or your CBAs for ingredients. You just can't. And I understand that because I've been a part of those conversations, assisting with that relationship. That's not a position I like to do, but I got involved because of just my experience with a wide range of ingredient vendors. But in terms of the GAs and the CBAs, not just from a microbial standpoint, but also from an ingredient composition and presentation standpoint, okay, of that ingredient. And the reason I say that is if you take, well, I'm not sure of a good example I can use. Let's just take wheat, for example. Wheat's pretty basic. It's pretty simple. You can source it from 25 or 30 different states here in the US. The problem, though, is the wheat you get from one region is going to be slightly different than the wheat you get from another region, whether it's in terms of protein or starch, fiber, etc. So again, if it's a large change and you're still using to make the same product, you're going to you're going to see a change somewhere in the process because of the different compositions of that wheat. And you may get the same, you may only have one vendor for wheat, but maybe he is sourcing it, that broker is sourcing it from multiple locations. So that's when coming in on annual audits, coming in, show me what you're doing, show me where you're getting your stuff from. Okay, for our process, we can only use wheat from this region because we know that with this product here, we get XYZ results at the extruder, dryer, coater, whatever. Whether it's changing bulk densities or it's changing starch gelatinizations, we need the wheat from here only. Can you please just source that for us and not mix it around? Because that's the other challenge is when they bring a load in, potentially, or they've got 6 trucks lined up, you may have 2 trucks from Wyoming, 1 truck from Nebraska, and 1 truck from Texas. And they're all dumping into the same silo. Well, what does that do for consistency within the process? It may not sound like a big deal. Not every silo is going to empty out first in, first out. You can't have that guarantee to 100%. So there's going to be some intermingling of those different wheat flours. Same in grinding. Some batches might grind harder than the others. That's going to affect throughput. And definitely at the preconditioner and extrusion, where you're under higher temperatures, you're under a whole lot of higher pressure. And anytime you have a mild variance on the front end, you put that under 600 pounds of pressure, then that little bit of variance at the front end is going to be multiplied because of that higher pressure. And I think also it's wise that the supplier has annual alerts to say, hey, we've made changes to our process. Hey, we may have an issue with ingredient sourcing from these areas. Is that going to pose a problem? So that comes down to the communication part and the relationship between the manufacturer and the broker or ingredient supplier.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. It's a lot like the regionalism in any kind of food product. That's why champagne can only be called champagne if it's from a certain region in France.
Exactly. Yeah, whiskey, scotch, bourbon. Exactly.
Right. You want the champagne of wheat.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So things that are beyond an individual plant's control or different environmental processes and the environment in the plant. How can a facility better integrate their environmental monitoring programs into their overall preventive control strategy?
Yeah, good question. Environmentally, the biggest challenge I see is managing airflows. in terms of monitoring pressures, differential pressures between pre-kill and post-kill areas. I would say, yeah, environmentally, that's going to be the biggest thing. Everything else is handled with prescriptive functions, so I'm not too worried about those. I think you need to monitor the pressures between those areas. If that's what you're trying to do, which it's all the newer plants that we see nowadays, they're actually doing that. They're monitoring the pressures because they would used to put in the air handling systems. They'd walk through with a pico gauge and say, yep, or pico tube, and they say, yep, we're good. And then they leave. If there's no constant monitoring, how are you going to know if a damper falls apart and is blocked open, or a filter is plugged, or maybe you're starting to lose a wheel bearing on the plug fan, so you're not getting those as much air velocity as you need. So monitoring, like in your pre-kill zone, let's monitor differential pressure. Let's monitor air humidity. Let's put magnehelic gauges on the filter so we know when they start to fail. So put a pico gauge in the air plenum so that reports back to the control system, or some system that then can alarm maintenance or alarm management saying, hey, we're seeing a problem in this area.
Gotcha.
And that instrumentation, it's not very expensive. It's more expensive to get the right airflows to begin with. So if you've invested the money on the makeup air units and the cleaners and the scrubbers, it is minimal to add this other instrumentation to monitor it, record it, and log an alarm if you need to for replacements and maintenance.
And it's kind of a stitch in time saves 9. Do it right first and then monitor.
My grandpa used to say that.
Yeah, I think everybody's grandpa did. So speaking of that, the ultimate in monitoring and oversight, what advice would you give companies that are preparing for a regulatory inspection to ensure that their food safety systems are going to perform under scrutiny?
And I have been a part of numerous of those type audits and reviews and accreditations over the years. The best thing to do is always be prepared with documentation so your auditor stays in a good mood.
Mm-hmm.
I know that sounds silly. It really does. But if you say he's going to be here at 8:00, you get a room set up for him at 7:30. All your documentation is there. Your appropriate accreditation staff members are there to greet them. That's the best way to proceed. Because when that person walks in and goes, oh, well, you've already got all this ready for me. Okay, well, let's get to work and we'll get out of here. To me, that's again, it comes down to communication. When they walk in and see that, you are communicating to that group, whether the auditor or accreditation, you're communicating saying, we're an open book. You're here to help us do a better job and make sure we're doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And they like to see that. And definitely don't shy away from presenting your shortfalls. If you've had a hit or you had an incident, whatever, don't try to cover them up. Show them, make sure that they're aware you're not, hey, we had a problem. By the way, here's our corrective actions. Here's how we verify that they're still working even today. So be proud of those moments as a learning moment. And it's always good to execute a preliminary inspection with an outside group, especially if you've got a young team that's never done this, or it's been a long time, turnover, whatever the reason is. It's always good to have somebody come in and say, hey, why don't you give us an audit and give us a test run, see how we do. So those are always very helpful. If you've got the right approach to it, you can learn a lot from them.
Gotcha. Do a practice run.
Yeah, do a practice run. And again, there's lots of private groups out there that are really good at what they do in terms of doing those test type audits.
Gotcha. So let's take a question from the audience actually about some of those requirements. We had a question about how do you think that these requirements will evolve and change in the future?
It's hard to say, really. And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. It all depends upon, nobody can foresee the future in terms of what are these genres going to look like in 5 years or 10 years, as far as walking down the pet food aisle. Nobody has a crystal ball. So it always comes down to the inventor, whether that's the consumers or that's the manufacturer or somebody who's just an entrepreneur that wants to make a new product. They will be responsible for the initial design. That's just the way it works. And that's the right way to do it. Like I said earlier, in terms of when should government step in? Well, they should wait as long as possible before they step in and say, you might be doing it wrong. Okay, but until that point, it's up to the inventor, the entrepreneur, that says, I've got a new idea here, but I want to make it safely. Let me do some research. Let me evaluate, do some internal testing and thresholds. And then now I'm making a good product. Only with further exposure and growth in the system will it potentially fall under additional scrutiny. And I don't mean scrutiny in a bad way. Additional scrutiny could mean internal, because as that product brand grows, they've got more resources. They're going to do more testing to make sure I've now got a larger company that I need to secure commercially. So let me invest more into it to make sure, yes, we had it right the first time, or oops, we missed a small gap here. Let's make a modification. So scrutiny just doesn't mean from outside. I hope it comes from within. That would be the best way for that to move forward. But as we all know, with any product out there, at some point, somebody's going to want to look at it and make sure that it's being done correctly. And there's no way to avoid that.
Gotcha. Do it right the first time, once again.
Well, or at least get it as close as you can the first time, right?
Right.
I mean, I said,
So-
that's not a bad method or process. That's how it's been done for years. With everything, with all these new pet food products out there, whether it's a chew toy or a dental stick, we all think we're doing it right. We do the best we can, but time will tell us if we need to go back and retack a course.
So when people are kind of looking at their systems that they have, what is one practical change that a manufacturer could implement today to strengthen their food safety system? What would you recommend from your experience?
In my opinion, everything needs to be science-based verifications. Everything. That's in my mind. And I think it's practical. I think there's, from what I can search, there's a lot of prior art that's available to the public, whether it comes from academia, that you can look at and say, hey, we've got that similar issue, or we've got the same construct. Let me pull that, which is science-based, and apply that to what I'm doing over here. I think that's very practical. Again, with the internet these days, with AI, finding the information you need is actually not that hard. And it's going to be a large undertaking if you're not currently, everything's not science-based in your place. I'm not saying you're doing it wrong, but I think you could be a little bit better if you've got science to back everything up. But as the saying goes, it's not going to be easy process, but how do you eat an elephant, Tim? One bite at a time.
One bite at a time, right?
That's right.
Another one the grandpas like to say.
Exactly.
Yeah, so basing everything in science and really focusing on employees, making sure that you kind of reevaluate things from the get-go, involving some themes that we've covered. So now that we've kind of gone over some of what we talked about before, let's take some questions from the audience and see what some of the topics are on the mind from some of our guests out here. I've got one here. Do you see more hiccups in facilities that are running multiple product types, such as cans versus kibble versus treats? Are the food safety processes different between those different formats?
So let me answer the questions first, and I'll come back and maybe explain. Do I commonly see more hiccups when I see plants that have a diversity of products? I would say as a rule, no. And number two, the answer is yes, the structures are different. It goes back to, because there's not a whole lot of facilities out there that do both canned and kibble. Does the can potentially offer more risk for the kibble side? Yeah, there's potential there. Of the ones that I've been into, they're aware of that. And they've installed systems to make sure that there is no crossover between those two subsystems. So as long as you do it right, I would not be scared to have a plant myself that did both dry expanded and wet and even treats. That's designed correctly. And again, good team, education, science-based, all that, you should not see more hiccups. Now, if you're a group that's one of the bad actors, if they're already out there, then it doesn't matter what plant you have, right? If you don't have the culture or the training, it doesn't matter what you're making. It's not, you could be making chew toys and there's going to be problems with it. So no, that doesn't concern me. And I've been in quite a few of those plants. Yeah.
Good.
Good question though.
Another one here about preventive maintenance programs are the key to having a food safety program on site well. Do you recommend PM software to apply or any particular PM software to apply in the industry?
Oh, see, I made a rule never to offer accolades to one group or another. They all do pretty good. I would say Red Zone is the one I come into contact with the most. but I've come into contact with a few others. I've seen actually some tailored PM packages that were made. They're one-offs made by their own internal group that have worked very well.
Mhm.
It depends on where you're at in your company growth and how large you are. If you're a large corporation with multiple facilities, it might be worth to tailor one, have one designed just for what you want, just for your equipment. If you're a single facility with one extruder or two extruders, buy something off the shelf because you probably don't have the funding to invest in something that's tailored. I hope that answers the question, but it wasn't trying to be ambiguous, but yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the situation. And speaking of that, speaking of, maybe some of those new companies that are just coming in, one extruder, just getting started, what is something that you might stress to those, or to a new build, like building a new facility? What would something you would stress for them when they're first coming into the pet food market, especially if they're coming from another industry?
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you added that last piece, especially if you're coming from another industry. If you're coming from a different industry and coming into pet food, you need to partner with a group that's familiar with, or with a team that's familiar with what it takes to make pet food and the best way to design that facility. Because that's, if you, like we said earlier, and we've seen it even as, in the last 10 years, if a new facility, if it's not designed correctly, it will cause you heartaches for years to come. So I would urge you to go out there, meet some people, go to the shows, interrogate every expert you can find about how to build a pet food plant, and use that team to move forward. Make sure you've got a team that's, number one, that's done it before.
Mhm.
Okay. If a group has designed, built, commissioned, whatever, a pet food facility, you're not going to find all that aspect in one group. So it's going to be a team of people. So that they've got to have experience in whatever aspect they're joining the team for.
So once again, it all comes down to having the right people and the right team.
It does, yeah.
Good deal. Well, I would like to thank our audience for those great questions. And we are now coming up to the top of the hour. Will, did you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to add?
No, I think we had some good discussions here, Tim. I appreciate you joining us, and I do appreciate the audience questions. It's one thing for Tim and I to just go back and forth, but it's always good to hear what you guys want, what's bothering you, what questions you have. And I would think, Tim, we've got a structure in place that if we didn't get to their questions, you can send those out to me, and I can answer them via email offline. Is that okay?
Oh, certainly, certainly. Yep.
All right, perfect. But again, thank you for your time, and I think it was a great event.
Well, great. And thank you, Will. And thank you again to our audience. And I'd like to give a great big thank you to Neogen and Pet Food Compliance for sponsoring this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro. Want for more Ask the Pet Food Pro chats, brought to you by Pet Food Industry and Pet Food Forum. I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. And again, thanks to Neogen, Pet Food Compliance, and our guest, Will Henry, founder of Turkey Creek Holdings, who you can ask questions of later. And also big thanks to the Watt Global Media staff for making this possible. And thank you to our international audience for joining us. I hope that you all enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on which hemisphere is your home. So until next time on Ask the Pet Food Pro, goodbye.